be talking to us this morning about co-design, group therapy to bridge the client-user gap. So please welcome Stavros Garzonis.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Gavin, and the organizers for putting this wonderful conference together today. I'm very honored to be here and talk to you. Let's start with who can run a co-design session? Okay, one or two hands. Maybe I should start with who can raise their hand up? Some people still can. Okay, I'll take that into account. Let's something simple. Who can sketch? Okay, a third of the audience. Who can sing? Dance? So imagine that if this was a nursery school, a very large nursery school, and you were all 4 years old, and I was asking you, can you sketch or can you dance? What will happen? I'll tell you what will happen. You'll be jumping up and down. You say, me, me, me. Some of you would be singing already. Now, the point of this, and this is not my point, if you've seen TED Talks by Sir Ken Robinson talking about how creativity is being beaten out of us in education, the point is that we think there's a right way of doing everything, and we're not worthy of doing it. So I didn't ask you if you can sketch exceptionally well. If you can sketch well enough to communicate a message and bring value to a conversation, then you've done that and you reach your objective. So similarly with co-design, we think, and many people consider definitions and they have different ways of thinking about it, but we think there is a right way of doing it and we couldn't possibly do it. So hopefully here after this talk, more of you will be willing to try and yes, maybe fail, although fail is a bit relative, but learn from it, iterate, and be able to bring value to your clients or your organization. So let me structure a little bit about how we're going to spend the next 30 minutes. I'm going to first talk about the context of co-design. When do we do it in a project and why? Then a little bit about how we actually plan a session. Then briefing your accomplices, the people who will be in the room, the people who will be helping you. Running a session and then learning from it. Now, this is roughly the proportions of the talk as well. I'm going to spend a lot more time in the first bits, because when it comes to running a session, if you've done the previous bits right, if you brief your accomplices the way you should have, and if you've planned the session and you're doing it at the right part of a project, running a session is pretty much like any other workshop. You're probably able to do that. We heard some really good techniques that Jenny mentioned, and I'm sure you're aware you're using your own. So you can bring them in there. I'm not going to spend too much time on that, because I take that you already know how to do that. So let's start with a context, and of course with a Wikipedia definition. So co-design is a process that we empower, and we encourage, and we guide users so they can design solutions for themselves. So forget everything that Thomas said, right? Don't ask your users. But actually, there is a twist in that, and I'm going to get to it. Now, as I said, many people consider define co-design in different ways. In my view, these three distinct groups are necessary to run a co-design session. Of course, I have UX agency up there because I work for one. At cxpartners, we do often this kind of work where we push the envelope and get all of us UXers out of our shells and trying new techniques so we can empower our clients and not just do good design, but do the kind of transformation that clients need in order to bring that into their organization. Of course, you need the users. I don't think I need to convince you about that, and the clients. And so this is what I call co-design. Now, in terms of why I think all of these three should be together, let's look at the risks of excluding each one of the groups. Now, I've tweeted at the break questions. I don't know if we have on Twitter, or if anyone would like to start by telling me a risk that if you exclude the clients and you do a co-design session with just you as a UX expert and the users, what would be the outcome or the risk? Doesn't include business strategy. Yes? Sorry? Client won't buy into it. You create no TO. That's an excellent one. So in a way I've tried to summarize this is that you create solutions that are not grounded in reality. They are not, they're not grounded in reality, and the limitations and the strategy that the client has, so it's not very likely to be adopted. Now, if you were to do that without the users, which is probably more likely you would have that no-TO idea, because the client and the UX agent are sitting together and saying, oh, have these wonderful ideas, let's just do that. Then, in essence, you are essentially what Tomer was saying, you're solving the wrong problem. Now, what would happen, and at this point I would like to stress that when I say UX agency, if you're in-house, you are the UX agent. Your clients are your internal clients, so you need to make that distinction and say, in that session, I'm the UX agent, and you are the stakeholders who bring all those knowledge and the limitations that we know businesses have. So what will happen if we exclude that UX agent? It is, and it's called focus group. Yeah? So what will happen is that we often see that where it's becoming too marketing-led, and it's all about trying to validate what I already think is correct as a marketing agent. So, but there are limitations, or there are risks, even if we include all of the three, right? And one could say that maybe it's a combination of all. But what would you say is the biggest risk if you were to run a co-design session like this? Like the lowest denominator. It's a good one. Anyone else? Well, I've heard a few, and mainly what comes up is like it's going to be chaos, right? How could you possibly do that? You're going to have the clients trying to bully users into, that's what you want, isn't it? Yes, tell me that this is what you want, because that's what I've already sold to my senior stakeholders. And you may get users kind of insulting clients. I don't know if you've ever seen that, where you say, oh, whoever created that message was a complete beep, and that person is in the room, right? He's one of the clients. So these are possibilities, and I think maybe the biggest fear, and the one I have when I walk into that, is like, maybe I lose face to the client. Maybe it flops, it doesn't go well, they don't get what they need, and I walk away thinking, oh, I've wasted their money. So we're going to talk about how and what we can do to mitigate for these risks. Starting with a typical setting for a co-design session, I would create teams. And say in this example, I have 4 teams, and I will plant one facilitator in each team. I'm going to talk a little bit more about the role later on. Then you're going to have some customers in each team, and you're going to have some stakeholders. Now, we want a ratio that is either 1-to-1 or actually favors the users. You don't want to have a table that is dominated by the stakeholders. But what's missing from here is that meta-facilitator. And I am talking to you as these meta-facilitators of the future. So I'm trying to empower and encourage you and give you some guidance to be that person in the middle who pulls all of this together. Now, I don't know if you've seen the Double Diamond by Design Council. Anyone seen it? Okay, people who are not putting their hands up, you probably know it, but you haven't seen it. So what the Design Council did actually went to a lot of design agencies, and they analyzed their process. And then they came up with, this is the, if you like, the abstract or the conclusion of what successful design agencies do. And I do actually talk a lot about this with startups. We're doing the Google Launchpad for startups, and they come in for UX coaching. But we start from that, because a lot of them, as Tomer very well demonstrated earlier, are not following the process of first falling in love with the right problem, getting a good design brief that they then go away and they develop. The idea of the diamond is that you first diverge in your ideas, in your potential solutions, and then you converge into defining the one that really you need to take forward. Another way of saying it is that if you don't do the second diamond, you're basically daydreaming. So that's you and me at the pub talking about how amazing it would be to disrupt the industry and do all of these wonderful things, and then forget about it and carry on with our day jobs. And if you don't do the first one, which is what most startups are guilty of, they're actually solving the wrong problem. So the idea is that you need both of them. And the reason why I'm mentioning this is because I promised to tell you about the context of when to use co-design. And another thing is that the last time I talked about this, I actually got a bit of criticism about being too waterfall. I know we're all falling in love with Agile, but this is not to say you need to spend 3 months doing the first one and then the next one, right? This is a thinking process. So you could sit in one day, and that's what we often do with startups, and you go through that process, first defining the right problem, then exploring solutions. And you may want to repeat and rinse as many times as you want, Agile-like. So when to do co-design? Well, where I do co-design is at that part of the diamond, whether being the first or the second, where we're still diverging, but we are at the point where we want to start closing in and start defining a little bit more of what we want to do next. So you could be collaboratively exploring the problem space, or you could be collaboratively exploring the solutions. So here's the twist. It's not about design. I know the title kind of misleads you. But in that process, we don't want to say, oh, you know, designers who've been trained and do that for a living for decades, we don't need you, because we're going to have users and stakeholders, and they'll come up with a solution. That would be if we were at the very end of the diamond, or close to the end of the diamond, where we expect the solution to be produced there. So for me, this is about exposing all that knowledge that is within the stakeholders and all the needs that are within the users by the medium of design, so that we can go away, digest them, transform them, and come up with solutions that meet those needs. So if we see that in a kind of a spectrum between developing a concept or a product idea or a user interface, I see it seeing a bit more to the left. I can show you some examples of projects that I've worked with, and some of them are about product development, some of them are about marketing messaging, some of them are about interface. So in this example, people were creating storyboards, they were creating personas, and the end goal was to create a product that was new to the organization we're working with. And we used monopoly money for people to be able to attribute value to the different features. Now, one thing didn't work very well. We gave monopoly money to everyone, including users and stakeholders. So they all put it up, then we took our pictures, took them down, counted the money, and then we thought, wait a minute, what did users want and what did stakeholders want? That can be very different. So in the future, I don't know if you can see here, some of them have a little dot, a little sticker dot. So we give to the stakeholders marked, if you like, notes. So we can see if there is a discrepancy between the two. Now, this example, we had an international client coming to us and say, we would like you to do user testing, right? Because that's what we do for them, about the marketing message. It's like, wait a minute, we don't do marketing, but I thought, well, maybe we can help with that, but it's not user testing. You don't want to sit down in a room with a participant and say, what do you think about this marketing message? Do you like it? Right? So what we did is a co-design session, and in that process, we got both the stakeholders and the users talking about their experiences. It was about hotels, right? So it was about traveling to a new destination, what are the things you like, what are the things you're looking forward to. And towards the end, we had this equivalent of the fridge magnets, and we had people collaboratively building their own messages. And it worked considerably well. The downside was that the client said, oh, but these 6 people you happen to bring into the room today are not responding very well to marketing messages. I thought, you mean people? I said, no, the 6 people. I said, OK, so we're now taking that on an online survey. We'll have 300 respondents, and then we're going to tell them, well, maybe now you're convinced that you need to have meaningful marketing messages. And then this is kind of moving along the spectrum into more tangible, where we are designing different interfaces, doing this sketching, collaboratively sketching, and contributing with critiquing. It was an interesting exercise where we had 3 different teams. Each one designed 1 page. Then we rotate, and the next team critiques that page that the other team did. Rotate again. The 3rd team redesigns the first one, kind of take away a little bit of not feeling, taking feedback or critique personally. So in terms of the context, conclude the first section, this is just an example of how we could use it. You don't wake up one morning and say, OK, my client needs a co-design session. You put it in context of the project. So you're very likely to have talked to a lot of stakeholders first to understand their needs, talk to a lot of the users, understand their needs, maybe have a workshop where you plan some things with the stakeholders, with the business, so you know that you're delivering what they need. You do the co-design, and then from then on, as I said, this is not the end. This is where you get a lot of information to take away in building prototypes and in design. And of course, don't forget testing. So what's different when you're planning a workshop where you may have only users or only stakeholders, and when you're planning a co-design session? I'm first going to start with the basics, because any of these mistakes cost a lot more. You have, remember, a more potentially chaotic situation. You need to make sure the client leaves there thinking you're slick and everything that they paid for is worth it. So the space. Know your space. If you've never been there before, visit it before, ask for photographs so that you know it's appropriate. So this example is not an appropriate space. I only found out when I walked into the room, because all the tables are close together. We can create separate teams in different tables. There's not much wall space because of windows. So you need to, if that doesn't work well, you start on the back foot. Of course, you need all the materials. You know all of that. What I always forget is the name labels. Hugely important to have the name labels, because you want people in the room to build rapport with each other. You don't want to be a mate. What did you mean by saying that? Right? You want this to be to feel as comfortable as possible. Obviously, food and beverages. We often do this in the evenings because if they're 2 or 3 hours long, users don't often have the flexibility to take time during the day, especially if your demographic is target group is people on professions that are difficult to get out of. So maybe, halfway through at the break, we crack on a beer as well, a bit of a boost. Make sure that they are well fed and they have the drinks to carry on. Lots of signposting, somebody to take photos, so you can give talks like this one and say, look at the great things we did. You put them in the reports for the clients. And always have somebody that is your right hand. Usually it's a project manager in our case, because there's so many things that you're going to forget, like the name labels, and you don't want to be the one who runs about like a headless chicken trying to sort out crises. So the basics, plan for success, not failure. Then when it comes to planning the actual session, again, we think about it as one of these diamonds, right? So you may want to start with a warm-up exercise, and if you have enough time, and then you do exercises that are a little bit more divergent thinking, right? You want people to explore the ideas, whether it's about the problem or whether it's about the solution, and then you start converging. So if you do 6 ups, loads of different sketching, you are diverging, then you do dot voting, then you select good ones, and you iterate, and you redefine them, and then you start with kind of converging. So a handy tip for this one is because it's very difficult to predict how long some exercises are going to take, have some optional exercises that you don't tell anyone, and then if you find that things have been moving very swiftly, you have something to plug in. But if things are going well, you don't want to stop an exercise just because it's been the 10 minutes you programmed. If you get very good engagement during that exercise and you're still getting value out of it, you let it slide, skip the optional exercise. When you have these exercises up, whatever it is that you choose to do, have it all the time there. People will keep asking you, what is it that we're doing again? You may have explained it 5 times. Leave it up there and explain to people exactly how they're expected to do it, whether it's individually or in a group, and how long it's going to take. Now, I did try having the timer up. That's a bit too much. that's going to stress people out, that's going to be looking at the clock all the time. And it doesn't leave you the flexibility to be able to deviate from that. If you think you're not getting much value, cut it short. No one's keeping an eye on the clock. And a very good advice I got, a lot of these things, actually, my colleague Mark Hicks has mentored me into it. Very good advice I got was to say, when it's close to the end of time of the exercise, you don't tell people you have 2 more minutes, because we all have a good sense of how long a minute is. And then if you cut it short or long, you're breaking your promise. So what you tell them, I'll give you a couple more moments. Right? A moment can be as long as you want it to be. So you can cut it short in 10 seconds or in 2 minutes. And provide them with templates. Right? You saw earlier we had the templates for the storyboards. We had a not very good template for a persona, but people did use magazines, so they can cut out and use stuff for their persona. And that's it. Whatever it is, the templates that you need, make sure that you have them beforehand. And it doesn't need to be something that is printed out. Sometimes just using the Sharpie and making a template that you then photocopy can work equally well. So in terms of planning the session, in terms of where you want it to fall within these 3 spectra, if you like, I think the first one is quite obvious, right? It's about getting that flow. It's about being in the space where people don't feel too stressed because they find it too difficult, and because people are not finding it a bit dull and boring. Of course, you have to be reading the room and adjusting as you go ahead, but plan for this. Obviously, focused, not under-facilitated or over-facilitated. You need to be in that sweet spot of planned spontaneity. So you've already have an idea of where you want to get and how, but you can deviate and keep it focused. Now, with the last one, where do you think the arrow should drop? Who thinks it should be more on the left, verbal? Who thinks it should be more visual? It's in the name, right, co-design. But that means you haven't been paying attention, because I said it's not about design, it's about research. And for that reason, I put it in the middle. Because I think, and what I've seen, is when people share stories, that's when the group therapy element happens, right? We had a co-design session with a credit company, and there were people in the room that were telling us stories they don't tell their friends. Having a bad credit can be a bit shaming. It's something you don't want to share with your friends. But people in the room were opening up, and they were telling us all the problems they've had to go through and what solutions they've tried. And the clients at the end were like, we've seen user testing so many times, but that was something else. They actually empathize with the users. And I like to use this analogy, stretched as it might be. I don't know if any of you have been to the zoo, probably have. I don't know which one of the little animals you like. I took my nephew, and he really liked the penguins. Going down the slides, and you observe them. And it's wonderful observing them, but it's from a distance. And the analogy I use is, what if you were able to invite them to sit down with you and play Scrabble? Something that you actually do together. Okay, they'll be really, really bad at Scrabble, but nevertheless, you get to that kind of happy middle of qualitative between stories and visuals that bring people together, the stakeholders and the users, and this is where the magic happens with bridging the gap. So when it comes to the team dynamics and how you split them up, we talked about the 1-to-1 ratio, or actually having more users, the meta-facilitator, and obviously it's good to split the clients in different functions. You don't want to have the marketing people sitting together at the same table and the product people at the same table, because you won't have that cross-pollination within each team. And you should have done some user research, right? So that you know that the target audience falls within behavioral segmentations, personas. And again, what you do here is you group people together, people who fall under the same persona, because they're going to have more in common to share and more in common to connect with each other. And again, share the stories that the clients are going to observe. So another thing to consider is whether the personalities, if you know your clients well, if you have personalities yet that you think may clash, you may want to keep them separate, or you may want to bring them together because you want to expose those differences of opinion if they are very, very strong. Now, the last point about introducing friendly competition, we try to do that, and the reason for doing this is because you want teams to be engaged, right? But how do you judge at the end of a, I don't know, a persona-making exercise which one was better? You can't, right? And you don't want to tell people, oh, yours was rubbish because you can't sketch. So we got away with saying, oh, you know what, you all tried really hard, you're all winners. It's a bit tacky. You can get away with it once. So I think that if you have actually planned very well everything we talked about, people are super engaged, right? We often have this fear that, oh, they won't pick up the Sharpie. But it rarely happens. People will pick up the Sharpie. People will engage, will get into it. So that's a last point about the users and who you bring in, team dynamics. We work with professional recruiting agencies. We actually work often with people for research. To get in people, not only that fall within your target group, but also be people who are by nature a bit more gregarious, a bit more, less shy, and will be happily engaged in a team. So it's very likely that during this you'll be thinking, I don't know what I'm doing. You'll be thinking, it's not going to work. All of these risks that we talk about. But as with any other thing that we do, if you trust the process and you follow the process, value will come. Right? It's not going to be perfect, but you're going to learn from it, and value will come. As Rolf Mollick says, anyone can do user testing because it's a resilient creature. No matter how badly you do it, you're going to get value. So when it comes to briefing your accomplices, with the users, we often like to give them homework. With user testing, you often tell them just turn up, right? We're going to be doing something about insurance. With this one, you say, OK, can you share stories that you had with us that you had with, say, a credit company? And this gets them in the mood. This gets them into the idea that they're thinking about it before they come. And it grounds the workshop in reality. We put up those stories often on the wall, and we start with those. We share them with a client. It's in the room. People can relate to each other. And it starts generating that empathy that clients have for the users even before it starts. Now, one thing to make sure is that you tell people that you're going to share those stories. Because we had one participant who blushed a little bit and thought, oh, I didn't realize that my personal story is going to be on the board when I walk in. So just a little thing to keep in mind. And here's some examples on how they look. You could have, whether it is on a website that sells viruses online, or whether it's about experiences with credit, people actually go into a considerable effort that they put to demonstrate how they felt about this. Some very emotive pictures they actually found on magazines to send us. I've seen co-design sessions. I've seen a talk, great chap at City University, who is using a lot of data that they gathered before and put them into the room, whether it is from user testing or market research. And that can work well, but there are two things you need to be wary of. One is they don't belong to the people who are in the room, so they don't have that sense of ownership. And the other thing is that they have to be really, really visual. If you just have, even if you have quotes up, they're unlikely to people to engage with them. They will glance over them. So if you have pie charts, if it's quantitative, or you have pictures, if it's qualitative, it would work a lot better. When it comes to briefing the clients, simple things. Make sure that they're there to listen, that they're there to engage, and that they should be potentially mindful of sensitivities that the users may have. Now, the biggest problem that we had with clients is that we took a lot of trouble to make sure that the users are there, and we made sure the recruiters reminded them. And then some stakeholders, right, at the end, they said, oh, you know what, a meeting came up, or I have this thing and I can't come, and that doesn't work. They need to understand that they're there to engage and not just drop in and out. So sometimes you may want to, if the client is building internal capability in UX, give them the role of facilitator to the people, so you help them grow. That's what we often do at CX. And if you have somebody who is very senior and wouldn't want to engage, okay, you take a notepad and you walk around and you take notes of the things that you find useful. In terms of the facilitators, you have two things you want them to try and do, facilitate and visualize. I think these are quite straightforward. You want them to maintain peace, but motivate debate. You want to maintain floor equality, but protect people who may be a bit too shy. Record any points of friction, because a team may come up and say, this is what we agreed, but if they spend a lot of time disagreeing, you should know that. And visualizing, not being the only one who holds SRP, but getting other people to do that and point them to the direction of visualizing. Obviously, what you want to do is have a person who can do both. As I said, in terms of running a session, I'm not going to spend a lot of time. Actually, I am out of time. There are many exercises to choose from, whether it's personas or whether it's the, remember with the dot voting to give different colored dots so you can do the analysis of what stakeholders and users did. There are two that I often use, which is the Dreamer Realist Critic. If you haven't seen it, look it up. It's something that Disney uses a lot, 3 different thinking hats for a creative process. And make sure you have catch-ups when you go through the sessions with, have catch-ups with your accomplices to make sure that things are on track. Now, one thing to mention just about the 6-ups is that do the content hierarchy before you start. Right? Jenny was talking about the feature hierarchy. You first have to decide what goes on the page, or if you're designing one page or one journey, and then do the multiple sketches to see what works and what doesn't. Another quick tip, always mark up, you may see in red and green, why things work and don't work, because people will be sharing those ideas with each other. Mark them up, because a week later, 2 weeks later, you can refer back to them and say, oh, no, we tried that, and that's why we didn't go with it. And a final tip, consider about not telling the brand of who is in the room, because that will predisposition people about the experiences they have with a specific brand. And it kind of reinvigorates the room if you bring it halfway through, and then they can start talking about it. So where all the money is possibly is that debrief session, right? That's my last slide. This is about asking users at the end, as you having the handshakes and people are leaving, how they found it, how they feel about it, how their perception changed about the product that you were talking about. And then keep the clients in for another 20, 30 minutes and ask them, what did you take away from it? And was it what you wanted? That can be in your report, should be in your report. If your stakeholders say, oh, that was amazing, and I really like that, they're like, taking notes, okay, here's the report, these are the things you found out, these are the things that matter to you. And of course, the next day, because by now you are exhausted, talk to your facilitators and say, okay, what worked and what didn't work and why. So by the end, you should be getting a better understanding of the user needs, novel ideas of potential solutions, and that newfound empathy from your clients. If I were to ask you again now, who can run a co-design session? Well, yes, a lot more hands. Thank you very much. Go forth and co-design.